So next we're going to talk about behavior. We're going to just kind of touch on this subject a little bit because the whole presentation obviously is about behavior, but I want to talk specifically about the behavior that we are intervening on. So when describing behaviors, oftentimes teachers and practitioners use subjective language to describe, or they voice their report of behavior based on their personal opinion. The problem with this is it does not specifically define what the behavior is. So note to self when asking for behavior support on any of the learners that you work with, make sure that you use observable and measurable language when describing behaviors. What does that mean exactly? We want to get away from the circular reasoning. As mentioned just before, a lot of teachers, practitioners have a tendency to describe behaviors in a generalized way, such as immature or lazy, or this kid is just disrespectful. So that doesn't tell us much, and it also doesn't help the mentality of dealing with the behavior itself. Behaviors should be described using objective language. What are some challenging behaviors in the educational setting? Screaming, disruptive behavior. Again, what does disruptive mean? It looks different for every individual. Aggression, property destruction, elopement, self-injury. When talking about how the behavior looks and describing it in observable and measurable terms, this can be referred to as the operational definition. So again, we want to make sure that we are describing behaviors using objective language. The behavior can, number one, be observable. It's something that we can see, and from our observation, we can actually objectively describe what it looks like. And it's also something that we can measure, meaning it has a count. For example, it happens 25 times a day, or you can get a rate, which is the average frequency per day over a period of time, or it can be measured in length of time, such as the duration. Here's a quick example of how to operationally define behaviors. Aggression. Instead of just saying the student is so aggressive, he constantly attacks other students, or he's trying to attack me. What does that mean? A more objective way to describe it is open hand hitting on the one-to-one's back, then scratched teacher's forearm, drawing blood. Total 4 hits, 1 scratch. Very easy, almost more of a simple way to explain and describe the behavior. Or if you're going to say self-injury, instead of saying destructive to himself or hurting himself, how do they hurt themselves? They use a closed fist to punch their side of the right leg. And then you can measure that, tally, count, 3 hits. Here's another 2 examples of elopement and property destruction. And that's where we'll finish off with how to describe behavior. Moving right along here, we have the consequence. Consequence in the 3-term contingency, as talked about earlier, stands for the event that occurs immediately after the behavior. What consequences appear to reward the problem behavior? This is what we want to look for. What happens after the behavior? Because whatever happens is something that is causing that behavior to occur again tomorrow and the next day and the next day. We really want to identify this pattern. This can be narrowed down to 2 categories. Number 1, either something happens and it's because the student wants to obtain something, or they want to avoid something. So the consequence that is provided for them can get them one of those 2 things. They either get what they want or they get out of what they don't want. Remember, as talked about earlier, behavior is communication. We need to identify the patterns, and we do this by paying attention to the before condition, which is the antecedent, and the after condition, immediately before and immediately after the behavior occurs. Now, let's talk about some reactive strategies. in the behavior world, we talk about this using the name consequence. That is the C in the ABCs. So consequence-based strategies, meaning what is something that we can do once we see that the behavior is occurring. There are a number of consequence-based strategies, but to simplify this and to give you something that can be taken away from this presentation, I'm going to narrow it down to 3. We have positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement, and extinction. And remember, consequences are used to establish and strengthen replacement behaviors, and they are also used to remove whatever is reinforcing the current problem behavior. So I don't want us to think of consequence as, oh, a negative connotation. Consequence means they're going to get timeout. No, in the world of behavior, consequence is simply the event that follows the behavior. And remember, we can manipulate the environment and change some of those factors and variables so that we can effectively intervene once the behavior occurs. Again, yes, consequence-based strategies is also positive reinforcement. And now we're going to talk about the power of reinforcement. If we know the function of the behavior, we will also be able to tell which type of reinforcement is the most valuable when we teach a replacement behavior. Intrinsic motivation does not come naturally. We have to remember that our students have difficulty communicating and they have disabilities that are manifesting through behaviors. We can't expect them to do what they ask, to do what we ask them to do simply because we asked them. We have to make it worth it for them. Quick overview of reinforcement. Positive reinforcement. It means something is added after the behavior. This is kind of a mind blow for a lot of people. Negative reinforcement, it doesn't mean it's bad. Negative reinforcement simply means something is removed following the behavior. What was removed after the behavior? Usually, when it has to do with negative reinforcement, the thing that was removed is something that is non-preferred or aversive, right? So, for example, individual screams out of class, teacher sends them out of the room. What was removed? The work or the class was removed, which means that they might continue screaming. If being removed from the room is in fact something that they wanted, and if they wanted to get out of work, that behavior will increase. We need to recognize the patterns of the ABCs. Here is a list of examples of an antecedent followed by a behavior followed by a consequence. If there's one thing we can take away from today, it really should be the 3-term contingency, that behavior happens in a sequential order and there's a history of it. And that's why it's continuing to happen. It happens with the antecedent happening before, and then the behavior occurring, and then the consequence occurring immediately after. Punishment. We talked about this a little bit. Use with caution. We're not talking about punishment as corporal terms or understanding of punishment. Punishment is a type of consequence that decreases behavior, and it's only considered punishment if the behavior decreases. It's not effective on its own, so that's why I say use with caution. If you're going to remove a toy that a student is playing with because it's distracting them from class, again, what's the function of playing with the toy? Are they trying to get out of something? Instead of just removing the toy, give them a way to appropriately escape the task. Removal by itself of the toy is not going to teach a new behavior. And actually, evidence shows that behavior will reemerge in another form, or it will intensify and the behavior will be worse. What does extinction mean? That means you're removing whatever the consequence was that was reinforcing the behavior. This is why we need to look at the history of consequences or the events that followed right after the behavior. Extinction, we're withdrawing the reinforcing consequence based on the function. For example, if the function is attention, remove attention following the behavior. If the function is escape, then do not allow escape. Instead, you can prompt for an alternative appropriate behavior. Really quick, let's touch on database decision making. This really helps to identify the patterns and keep in mind what the reinforcing consequences might be. And this needs to be at play when we identify and appropriately intervene on behaviors according to the function of their behavior. Few different ways to track data. ABC data. That is just record keeping of antecedent behavior, consequence, put the date on it. Remember, describe that behavior using objective language. You also want to keep a rate. How often is this behavior occurring? And at what time is it occurring? Again, we're looking for those patterns. You can record the duration. If there's long meltdowns, we're going to want to know how much of the school day or the learning or the instructional time is that behavior taking up. More on database decision making. Here is what is called a scatter plot data chart. So this breaks up data based on the time of day, and I also like to put in the specific activity that's happening. If we see a connection or a pattern of aggression occurring every morning from 8 to 8:30, then we can almost assume that aggression might be a way to escape morning meeting. Now, one very important thing to keep in mind when dealing with behavior, we have to recognize and we have to be mindful of the fact that our behavior influences the behavior of the learners that we interact with. Behavior influences behavior. We must be mindful of this. And we play a huge role in the environment. We have the ability to either escalate or de-escalate a behavior when it's happening. With that said, we're going to get into a new section of AB 1172 that I've included in all of my trainings this year. This has been really helpful. So if you haven't paid attention up to now, which I hope you have, at least pay attention to this so that you could recognize the phases of behavioral escalation and that you can transfer this to your workday and then hopefully have a better understanding of how to de-escalate behavior before it gets to its worst phase. So this is a bell graph, and the x-axis is time and the y-axis is intensity. So when looking at the phases of behavior escalation, we're going to see that the intensity rises over time and falls over time. So as you can see, starting with number 1, we have the baseline all the way up to number 5, which is this peak of the behavior escalation. And then once that behavior starts to de-escalate, when we know it's over, we're going to get to a phase called tension reduction. We're going to go through each one of those right now. Number 1, baseline. What is the baseline phase? This is the learner. We're going to talk about 2 things. We're going to go through the learner phases of escalation, and then we're going to go through the practitioner or the staff member response to each phase of escalation, starting with the learner or the student. During the baseline phase, what might we see? Here are some examples of observable behaviors. Individual may display the following: eye contact, responding to stimulus cues, joint attention, or participating in a group activity, sitting in their current designated spot. This doesn't sound like any problem areas. Correct, because it's not. Baseline is their typical mode of operation. Your learner or your student comes in and you can tell that they are their typical self and there's nothing causing agitation or behavioral escalation at this phase in the bell graph.